By the time Vincent Caruso walked into the federal courthouse to answer charges of tax evasion, wire fraud, and racketeering, every dollar he had was already gone. Not seized, not frozen, gone, moved, restructured, and legally dissolved across 47 shell entities in 11 jurisdictions over the course of 6 weeks. The woman who did it was sitting in the back row of the courtroom in a gray cardigan, watching him realize it, and she did not smile. Her name was Mara Voss, and nobody in that building had any idea who she really was. 6 weeks earlier, Mara had been standing in the open floor plan of Harrington Capital Partners on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, holding a cardboard box and listening to the laughter of 31 people she had spent 4 years making look good. She was 34 years old, 5'6", with the kind of body that took up space in boardrooms and made small men feel crowded, full-figured, steady, built like someone who has never once apologized for the room she occupied. She had a master's degree in forensic accounting from Columbia and a near-photographic memory for financial architecture. She had also, for 4 years, been deliberately letting her boss believe he was the smartest person in every room she entered with him. That morning, Vincent Caruso had decided she was no longer useful as a prop. Mara. He said it the way you say a word you're already bored of. He was standing at the glass partition of his corner office, tie loosened, cufflinks catching light, the kind of man who had learned early that cruelty is easier when it's performed for an audience. Collect your things. She had looked at him steadily. Is there a reason? The reason, he said, loud enough for every desk in the open floor to hear, is that I need a financial analyst, not a seat filler. You've been coasting in that chair for 4 years on the work of people half your size. He paused, and what came next was calculated, because Vincent Caruso never wasted cruelty on accident. Literally. The laughter started at the back. It moved forward like a slow wave. A few people covered their mouths. A few didn't bother. Mara did not move. She stood with the cardboard box against her hip, and she looked at Vincent Caruso with an expression that a stranger might have read as humiliation. It was not humiliation, it was calculation. She was counting exits, identifying witnesses, running a quiet inventory of everything she already knew about every account Harrington Capital had touched in the last 4 years. She said, "All right, Vincent, not Mr. Caruso. Vincent." And then she picked up the box and walked to the elevator. And nobody noticed what she did not take from her desk, because what she had already taken from this company existed entirely inside her memory. What no one in that office understood yet was that Mara Voss had been waiting for this moment for 11 months. 2 floors above Harrington Capital, on the 44th floor, a man named Dominic Real had been occupying a suite of offices under the name Real Advisory Group for 3 years. On paper, Dominic was a private equity consultant. In practice, he ran the financial and legal infrastructure of the Real family's interests across the northeastern United States, real estate, logistics, and a network of business arrangements that federal investigators had been trying to untangle since the early 2000s without meaningful success. He was 41, lean, with dark eyes that moved slowly across rooms and took in more than most people released in conversation. He wore his authority the way some men wear expensive watches, not to announce himself, but because it was simply part of how he was assembled. Dominic had been watching Vincent Caruso for 8 months. Not because of any personal grievance, business, always only business, but because Caruso had made the serious error of routing certain cash flows through entities that intersected, invisibly to Caruso but not to Dominic, with Reale family accounts. Someone had been skimming. The amounts were not enormous. The implication was. On the morning Mara Voss walked out of Harrington Capital with a cardboard box, Dominic Reale was standing at the window of his 44th floor office, looking down at the street below for no particular reason. He had not been in the Harrington floor. He had, however, been in the elevator 20 minutes earlier, and he had watched a woman in a gray cardigan stand across from Vincent Caruso in the lobby while Caruso performed his exit interview loud enough for the security desk to hear. Dominic had watched her face during it. He had watched what her hands did, perfectly still, box-balanced, not a single white-knuckled grip. He had watched what her eyes did, not down, not away, but at Caruso, with an attention that was clinical rather than wounded. He had made a mental note the way he made all mental notes, quietly and without forgetting. 3 days later, his assistant brought him a resume. He had not requested it. The cover letter was 4 sentences. It offered, without specificity, a forensic review of any financial structure he might wish to examine, with particular attention to irregularities in layered corporate entities. The last sentence read, "I have a professional interest in Vincent Caruso's accounts specifically, and I believe our interests may align." Dominic read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called her. Their first meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Mara arrived with nothing, no laptop, no folder, no notes. She sat across from him at a table in a private room at a restaurant he controlled, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and proceeded to reconstruct from memory the entire layered architecture of Caruso's financial operation, entities, jurisdictions, nominee directors, timing patterns, and the specific point at which cash flows suggested internal skimming. She named the approximate amount. She was off by less than 3%. Dominic sat very still for most of it. This was unusual for him. Most people who came to him with information came with performance, urgency, drama. The theater of whistleblowing. Mara delivered it the way an engineer delivers a structural report. Here is what exists. Here is what it means. Here is what happens if someone pulls this particular thread. He asked her one question at the end. "How long have you known?" 11 months, she said. "Why did you wait?" She looked at him without any particular expression. "Because I needed to be fired." There was a pause in the room that had a specific texture to it. The texture of a man recalibrating his entire assessment of a situation he thought he had already mapped. He offered her a position that afternoon. She negotiated the terms in under 10 minutes, accepted, and left. She did not thank him. He noticed that she didn't, and found that he respected it. What followed over the next 5 weeks was the most methodical financial demolition Dominic had witnessed in 2 decades of operating in environments where financial demolition was a professional skill. Mara worked from a small office adjacent to his, arrived before his security team and left after them, and communicated with him in written briefs that were so precise they required almost no follow-up questions. She didn't dismantle Caruso's empire dramatically. She did it the way you remove load-bearing walls, carefully in sequence, ensuring the structure above has nothing left to stand on before you take the final support. She moved assets through legal restructuring. She identified the 3 nominee directors Caruso used and built documented evidence of their actual roles. She mapped the skimming operation back to its source, a mid-level portfolio manager named Dale Finch, who had been at Harrington for 7 years, and whom Caruso trusted in the specific, careless way powerful men trust people they consider beneath notice. She built a case that was simultaneously available to federal investigators and to Dominic's own legal team, depending on which door someone chose to open it through. Vincent Caruso, during these 5 weeks, was busy. He had found out, through channels he considered reliable, that the woman he had fired was now working somewhere in the building above his office, and that she had taken a position with an advisory firm he didn't recognize. He had asked around. Nobody had told him anything useful because nobody who worked for Dominic Real told anyone anything, and because Mara Voss had been careful about what was visible and what wasn't. He had assumed she was filing a wrongful termination claim. He had told his lawyers to expect it and to handle it as a nuisance matter. He had privately made 1 or 2 remarks to colleagues about the kind of ambition that doesn't know its own limits. He felt, in these 5 weeks, very much in control of his situation. Psychologists who study the relationship between public humiliation and private overconfidence have documented what they call post-dominance blindness, the cognitive bias in which a person who has successfully humiliated someone in a social context dramatically underestimates that person's subsequent behavior. Dr. Robert Cialdini's research on social proof and status dynamics describes how public acts of contempt actually function as information suppression for the aggressor. The brain, having categorized the target as subordinate, stops processing them as a threat source. Caruso had publicly classified Mara. He had, therefore, neurologically stopped seeing her. This was the condition she had designed for. On a Wednesday morning in the 6th week, Vincent Caruso received simultaneous notifications from 3 different banks indicating compliance holds on accounts he controlled. His lawyer called within the hour. By noon, 2 federal investigators had arrived at the Harrington Capital offices with documentation referencing specific transactions, specific entities, and specific dates. Dates that corresponded with uncomfortable precision to the internal records that only a very small number of people had ever had access to. Caruso understood somewhere around 2 in the afternoon that this was not a coincidence. At 4 o'clock, he made the decision that confirmed everything Mara had predicted about him. He went upstairs to the 44th floor. He told the receptionist at Real Advisory that he needed to speak with someone about a mutual business matter. He was brought into a conference room. He waited 11 minutes, and then the door opened and Mara Voss walked in. Not Dominic. Mara. She set a folder on the table in front of him and sat down. "I thought you might want to understand what happened," she said, professionally. He stared at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man watching a category collapse. The face of someone whose mental filing system has just been told that the drawer labeled "not a threat" has been empty for months. "You did this." "Dale Finch did most of the initial damage to himself," she said, which was technically accurate. "I documented it." The folder contained everything, not a summary. Everything. The full reconstruction of the skimming operation, the nominee director network, the jurisdictional architecture, and a separate section she had titled, with characteristic precision, Whistleblower Disclosure Record, which established with time-stamped documentation that she had provided this information to federal investigators before any contact with any Reale entity. She had insulated Dominic completely. She had done it not because she was told to, but because it was the structurally correct thing to do. He looked at the folder, he looked at her, he went through the stages, the refusal, the calculation, the arithmetic of what was already in motion, the understanding that there was no version of the next 6 months that ended well for him, and his face made all of them visible. Whatever Vincent Caruso had been before he walked into this room, he was smaller when he sat down in it. Dominic came in after that. He was brief and without theater, which was how he handled everything. He told Caruso what was going to happen with the accounts that intersected with Reale interests, and he told him what Caruso was going to do about it, and he told him what would happen if Caruso chose a different path. Caruso, who had spent 20 years being the loudest person in every room, said nothing. There was nothing left to say that the folder hadn't already said for him. When they were alone, Dominic stood at the window, the same window he had stood at 6 weeks ago, on a different floor, watching a woman in a gray cardigan decide not to break. He was quiet for longer than usual. "You built the whistleblower protection before you came to me," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. That protected both of us. That was the intent." He turned from the window. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite the controlled neutrality he wore in business contexts. Something that had more weight to it, more attention. "Why didn't you tell me you'd done it?" Mara considered the question with the same care she applied to everything. "Because I didn't need you to approve it," she said. "And because I wanted you to find out after." He looked at her for a moment. "Why after?" Because how a person reacts to a decision they couldn't control tells you more about them than anything they say before. John Gottman, who spent 4 decades studying what he called the architecture of trust between people, identified competence witnessed under pressure as one of the primary engines of deep human bonding, not kindness, not shared history, but the specific experience of watching someone make a correct, principled decision when the cost of making it was real and the alternative was available. Dominic Reale had watched Mara Voss make that decision in a structure so carefully built that he had almost missed the fact that she had made it. He had not missed it. He said, "I'd like you to stay." She said, "I know, we should discuss terms." He almost smiled. "You were going to leave if the terms were wrong?" "I was going to leave if the terms were wrong." He did smile then, just barely. But Mara noted it, filed it, and said nothing about it. There would be time for what was underneath this conversation. There was, she was finding, a great deal of time. The last thing Vincent Caruso did before his lawyers advised him to stop doing anything public was to issue a brief statement through a communications firm suggesting that the compliance issues at Harrington Capital were the result of a rogue employee acting without authorization. Dale Finch's name appeared in the statement. No other names appeared in the statement. Mara read it at her desk on a Thursday morning, set it aside, and returned to the quarterly review she was restructuring for Dominic's legal team. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implies surprise, and she had not been surprised by a single thing Caruso had done since the day he told 31 people that she was a seat filler. What she felt was something quieter, the specific piece of a thing completed, of a structure built correctly from the foundation up that held exactly as it was designed to hold. Outside her window, Midtown moved in its usual organized chaos. Somewhere in a building 2 floors below a building she no longer worked in, a man was discovering the cost of the one assumption he had made about her, that because she had stayed quiet, she had nothing to say. Power, the real kind, rarely announces itself. The people who spend their lives performing strength are almost always covering the specific terror of someone who has never had it unconditionally. Mara had understood this at 26 and had built her entire professional life around the space that understanding opened. Not the space to be overlooked, the space to be underestimated, which is entirely different and infinitely more useful. She had walked out of Harrington Capital with a cardboard box and 11 months of architecture in her memory, and she had built exactly what she intended to build, in exactly the sequence she had planned, with one addition she had not planned, the particular quality of attention from a particular pair of dark eyes that had been watching her since an elevator in a midtown lobby, and that showed no signs of looking elsewhere. There are stories that are about what happens when someone finally gets to be loud. This was never that kind of story. The most dangerous people in any room are the ones who already know they don't need to be. If that idea stays with you, the power of what you choose not to show, hit the like button. It helps these stories reach people who need to hear them. And if you want the next one, subscribe, because the next story is about a woman who walked into a negotiation that was supposed to destroy her and walked out owning the table.